heavy scent of antiseptic filled the cramped intensive care unit in Charleston as I stood silently in the corner watching the man who was supposed to protect my sister become her ultimate executioner. My sister Sienna, a brilliant 42-year-old architect, lay motionless under the harsh fluorescent lights, while the rhythmic humming of the ventilator provided the only soundtrack to her struggle for survival. Braxton entered the room with a sharp-tailored suit and a face devoid of any husbandly concern, stepping toward the bed just to toss a thick envelope of annulment papers onto her unconscious form. "Wake up and sign these whenever you find the strength to stop playing the victim, Sienna, because I am officially done carrying the dead weight of your pathetic career." Braxton sneered while checking his gold watch with utter boredom. I felt a surge of adrenaline as he leaned closer to her ear, his voice dripping with a toxic blend of arrogance and disdain that made my skin crawl. "You always were a mediocre earner with no real ambition, and frankly, my rising status in this city deserves a woman who actually brings a fortune to the table, rather than someone living off my hard-earned commission checks." He continued, completely oblivious to the fact that Sienna's private architectural firm brings in over $200,000 a year. He straightened his silk tie and looked at me with a smirk that signaled he had already moved on to his next target. "Tell her not to bother calling when she gets discharged, Jada, because I am marrying Tiffany this weekend, and she is finally providing the elite lifestyle that your sister was far too poor to ever afford," he said before turning on his heel to leave the woman he had spent years exploiting. Braxton walked out of that hospital thinking he had successfully discarded a financial burden, never realizing he had actually just walked away from the most powerful woman in Charleston's architectural world. If you are ready to witness a betrayal so cold, turn into a masterclass in professional and personal destruction, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and stay tuned to see exactly how we make him regret every word he just spoke. Long before the medical monitors in that sterile Charleston hospital began measuring the fragile remains of a broken heart, my sister Sienna believed she had discovered a love that transcended the superficial world of South Carolina high society. Having built a massive architectural empire through years of grueling work and strategic brilliance, she chose to hide her true professional status because she desperately wanted to find someone who would cherish her soul rather than her bank account. When she first met Braxton at a local charity auction 3 years ago, he played the role of a humble yet passionate project manager who seemed to value her intellect above everything else in the room. He spoke with such convincing fervor about his dreams of preserving the historic beauty of the city, while maintaining a modest lifestyle that Sienna felt safe enough to keep her $200,000 annual salary a complete secret. I remember watching them walk along the Battery during those early months, while Braxton frequently lamented how difficult it was for a self-made man to break into the elite circles of the South. My sister, being the generous woman she is, began quietly pulling powerful strings behind the scenes to ensure that Braxton suddenly received invitations to the most prestigious bidding wars in the state. She would spend her late nights meticulously refining his messy blueprints and correcting his amateurish structural calculations so that his superiors would believe they had discovered a hidden architectural prodigy. Braxton started climbing the corporate ladder at a lightning pace because Sienna was essentially doing half of his executive workload while pretending to be a struggling freelance artist at home. Instead of remaining humble as his paycheck grew, he began to develop an insufferable God complex and truly believed that his sudden success was the result of his own mediocre talent. "I just don't understand why you're still sketching those little garden sheds when my firm is literally reshaping the entire Charleston skyline," Braxton said one evening while throwing his expensive leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. Sienna looked up from her desk with a faint smile and replied that she enjoyed the simplicity of her work, but Braxton only laughed while pouring himself a glass of bourbon that she had secretly paid for. "Simplicity is just another word for lack of ambition, Sienna, And frankly, it is getting a bit embarrassing to introduce you as my partner when you have nothing to show for your time." He continued while checking his new gold watch. Sienna remained calm and asked him if he remembered who helped him finish the structural load reports for the waterfront project last month. But Braxton simply waved his hand dismissively as if the memory were an insult. "I was the one in the boardroom making the pitch while you were just tidying up a few minor details that any junior drafter could have handled," he snapped before walking toward the kitchen to demand dinner. Sienna watched him walk away with a sense of quiet patience, thinking that his growing arrogance was just a temporary side effect of his new professional pressure. Yet the man she had mentored in the shadows was rapidly becoming a stranger. The dynamic of their household shifted drastically when a strategic partner's daughter, Tiffany, started appearing at every corporate gala that Braxton attended as the rising star of his firm. While Sienna stayed home to finish the heavy lifting on his latest heritage project, Braxton was busy laughing at elegant garden parties and introducing Tiffany as a brilliant associate who understood the true meaning of luxury. "You should really see the way Tiffany handles a room, because she has a natural elegance that you just can't learn from those dusty old architecture books of yours," Braxton remarked casually after returning home from a late-night gala. When Sienna pointed out that she had been working on his blueprints for 12 hours straight, Braxton merely rolled his eyes and told her that she was lucky he even kept her around to witness his greatness. He started staying out later under the guise of urgent client meetings while leaving Sienna alone with the very designs that were funding his extravagant social life and his growing betrayal. The more successful Braxton became through Sienna's invisible labor, the more he despised her for being the only person who knew exactly where he had started. "He began to treat our home like a hotel, and my sister like a convenient secretary, who was lucky enough to share a roof with a man of his supposed caliber." Even as he grew colder and more dismissive, Sienna remained convinced that their foundation was strong enough to survive the superficial temptations of his newfound fame. Little did she know that the man she had elevated to the top of the mountain was already preparing to push her off the cliff the moment he found a more profitable hand to hold. 3 months before the tragedy turned our lives into a whirlwind of legal battles and hospital visits. The atmosphere in my sister's coastal mansion shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a place of suffocating tension. Braxton decided to move his mother Dorothy into the guest suite without even consulting Sienna, claiming that the elderly woman needed a luxurious environment to spend her golden years. From the moment Dorothy stepped through the front door with her designer luggage and an air of unearned superiority, she established a regime of psychological warfare designed to break Sienna's spirit. Braxton encouraged this behavior by constantly siding with his mother in every minor disagreement and insisting that Sienna should be grateful for the presence of a woman with such high social standards. I walked into the kitchen one afternoon to find Dorothy inspecting the granite countertops with a white glove, while my sister was busy preparing a complex 3-course dinner. I truly expected a more refined palate from someone living in a house this size, but this cheap wine you bought for the sauce is practically vinegar," Dorothy remarked while pouring the expensive vintage down the sink. Sienna took a deep breath and calmly explained that it was a specific choice for the recipe, but Braxton immediately stepped into the room to cut her off. "Don't talk back to my mother, Sienna, because she has spent her entire life in circles you can only dream of entering," Braxton snapped while reaching into his pocket for his wallet. He pulled out a stack of bills and tossed them on the counter before demanding that Sienna go out and find a bottle that met his mother's supposedly superior standards. The financial demands escalated quickly as Braxton started pressuring Sienna to increase the monthly allowance he received for Dorothy's personal expenses and cosmetic treatments. "My mother deserves the best skincare that Charleston has to offer, and since you're just sitting here playing with your little drawings, the least you can do is contribute more to her comfort," Braxton stated during a heated breakfast conversation. Sienna tried to mention that she was already covering the entire mortgage and all the utility bills, but Dorothy just chuckled dismissively while adjusting her pearl necklace. A real woman provides a peaceful home for her successful husband instead of complaining about a few extra dollars for his mother's well-being," Dorothy added with a venomous smile. My sister remained silent and continued to fund their extravagant lifestyle through her secret business accounts, but the emotional toll began to manifest in her declining physical health. She started suffering from severe migraines and chronic fatigue because she was working through the night on architectural projects just to keep up with the family's mounting demands. One evening, while Sienna was resting, Dorothy entered her private studio and began rummaging through the drafting table with utter contempt for her professional privacy. She gathered several intricate blueprints that represented months of architectural innovation and prepared to throw them into the trash bin like they were worthless scraps of paper. "What are you doing with those designs, Dorothy? Because those represent months of my professional life and serious client commitments," Sienna asked with a voice that was trembling from a mixture of exhaustion and fury. Dorothy didn't even look up as she crumpled a master plan for a multi-million-dollar estate and dropped it into the wastebasket with a shrug. "If you spent half as much time being a proper housewife as you do scribbling on this expensive paper, perhaps my son wouldn't have to work so hard to maintain this house," Dorothy replied with cold indifference. Sienna stood there in stunned silence as she watched her hard work being treated like garbage, while Braxton stood in the doorway and told her to stop being so dramatic about a few pieces of paper. I pulled her aside later that night and begged her to kick those parasites out of her home because it was obvious that they were draining the very life force from her veins. Sienna just shook her head with a weary smile and told me that she truly believed her patients would eventually lead to a change in their behavior. Little did she know that the trash bin where Dorothy threw those blueprints was just the beginning of how they intended to dispose of her entire existence once they found a more profitable path to follow. 8 weeks after the arrival of Braxton's mother had already turned the house into a battlefield, the betrayal shifted from domestic cruelty to professional sabotage. I began noticing Braxton spending unusual amounts of time lurking around the hallway, leading to Sienna's private studio during the late hours of the night when he thought everyone else was asleep. My sister had been pouring her soul into the $1 million heritage project for several years, creating a masterpiece of architectural innovation that was meant to be the crowning achievement of her secret career. One rainy Tuesday evening, Braxton finally made his move by secretly entering her office and copying every digital file while also stealing the hand-drawn master blueprints from her secured drafting table. He immediately took these stolen designs to the firm owned by Tiffany's father and claimed they were his own original creations in a desperate bid to secure a high-level executive position. Sienna discovered the missing files within hours of the theft, but she surprisingly remained calm instead of confronting him in a fit of rage as I had expected. The family lawyer Julian arrived at the house shortly after the discovery to provide urgent legal counsel on how to handle such a massive breach of trust. "I need you to maintain the facade of the clueless partner for just a little longer, because we need him to believe he is untouchable before we pull the rug out," Julian whispered while we sat in the kitchen away from Dorothy's prying eyes. The tension reached a breaking point when Tiffany showed up at our front door later that week with a triumphant smirk while looking at Sienna with pure disdain. "I heard from Braxton that you're still struggling with those little amateur drawings of yours, which is honestly quite sad considering how fast his career is skyrocketing," Tiffany said, while deliberately blowing smoke into the room. Sienna didn't flinch or defend herself as she poured tea for the woman who was currently bragging about a career built on stolen labor and calculated lies. Braxton entered the living room and put an arrogant arm around Tiffany while looking at my sister, as if she were a piece of furniture he was planning to replace. "You really should start looking for a small apartment, Sienna, because once my heritage project officially launches, I won't have time to subsidize your failed artistic dreams anymore," Braxton sneered with a coldness that made my blood boil. Dorothy joined them on the velvet sofa and laughed while adjusting her pearls, as she added that a successful man like her son deserved a woman of high status rather than a lowly freelancer. I hope the project brings you everything you think you deserve, Braxton, because once it's out in the world, there truly is no turning back for any of us. Sienna replied with a voice so steady it felt like a death sentence. My anger flared even hotter when I caught Braxton in the hallway later that night, while he was secretly on the phone with his bank discussing the transfer of their joint assets into Dorothy's private accounts. I am done wasting my potential on a woman who brings nothing to the table, and by the time she realizes the money is gone, I will be halfway to a new life with Tiffany. Braxton muttered into the phone while he believed I was already upstairs. He had started openly preparing for a new life by treating Sienna like an annoying obstacle that he needed to remove as quickly and efficiently as possible. He didn't even bother to hide his contempt anymore, frequently telling her that she was lucky he even kept her around to witness his greatness. Sienna continued to watch every move they made with a haunting silence, while she meticulously documented every fraudulent transaction and every stolen design for the upcoming legal storm. She was no longer the grieving partner trying to save a failing relationship. She was a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at the people who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. I wanted to scream at her to fight back every time Dorothy made another cruel comment about her family's humble beginnings, but Sienna just squeezed my hand and reminded me that the tallest buildings require the deepest foundations. The atmosphere in the house was thick with the scent of impending destruction as Braxton and Tiffany celebrated their stolen victory with expensive champagne that my sister had ultimately paid for through her invisible toil. The storm clouds hanging over Charleston finally broke on a Friday night that would forever be etched into my memory as the moment Braxton's humanity completely vanished into the darkness. The mansion was filled with the elite members of the city, as Dorothy hosted a lavish dinner party to celebrate Braxton's fraudulent success with the Stolen Heritage Project designs. Sienna had been pushed to her absolute physical limit after weeks of enduring psychological abuse, while maintaining her secret architectural firm in the exhaustion of the night. As she was carrying a heavy crystal tray of appetizers through the crowded ballroom, her face turned a ghostly shade of gray before she collapsed onto the polished marble floor. Instead of rushing to his fiancée's side with concern, Braxton stood over her motionless body with a look of pure annoyance while clutching a glass of expensive champagne. I cannot believe you are choosing this exact moment to pull a pathetic stunt for attention when I am in the middle of closing the deal of a lifetime with Tiffany's father. Braxton hissed while the guests began to whisper in shocked tones. I reached out to grab his arm to beg for help, but he shoved a set of car keys into my hand and demanded that I call a taxi to take Sienna to the emergency room myself. I have more important things to do than babysit someone who lacks the basic stamina to survive a simple cocktail party, so just get her out of my sight before she ruins the rest of my evening, he added before turning his back on his unconscious partner to share a laugh with Tiffany. I sat in that cold hospital waiting room for hours until Braxton finally appeared near midnight with a cold, calculating expression that suggested he was there for business rather than comfort. He didn't ask the doctors about Sienna's condition while she lay in a deep coma, surrounded by humming life support machinery that kept her heart beating. Instead, he waited for the nurses to leave the room before pulling out his smartphone and grabbing Sienna's limp hand to press her thumb against the biometric sensor. This is the very last time you will ever be of any use to my financial future, so thank you for finally being quiet enough for me to finish our business without your constant nagging, Braxton whispered as he authorized the final transfer of her remaining liquid assets. He then walked over to the nursing station and informed the hospital administration that he was no longer responsible for her medical bills because their engagement was officially over as of that moment. Braxton and Dorothy returned to the mansion that same night and began the heartless process of erasing every trace of my sister's existence from the house she had fully paid for. They gathered her designer clothes and personal mementos into cheap plastic bags before throwing them out onto the wet pavement of the driveway under the torrential rain. Dorothy stood on the porch under a large umbrella and laughed while watching Sienna's original sketches and professional portfolio get soaked and ruined by the rising muddy water. A woman of her low standing should have known better than to think she actually belonged in a house this grand to begin with. Braxton. Dorothy shouted over the thunder as she kicked a box of Sienna's books into the street. Braxton looked at the pile of my sister's life on the sidewalk and replied that he had already planned to change the locks before the sun came up. I am done wasting my potential on a woman who brings nothing to the table, and by the time she wakes up to realize the money is gone, I will be halfway to a new life with Tiffany. He muttered while he believed I was still at the hospital. I stood in the shadows of the garden with my phone hidden, recording every second of their disgusting behavior and every cruel word they uttered as they destroyed her property. They truly believed they were the smartest people in the room, while they were actually walking directly into a trap that Sienna and Julian had spent weeks perfectly tuning for their ultimate downfall. Little did those two monsters know that the very rain that was ruining her clothes was also washing away the last remnants of her mercy for them. 10 days after that horrific night in Charleston, when the world thought my sister had finally been broken, the medical monitors in her private suite signaled the return of a queen. Sienna opened her eyes with a clarity that terrified the nursing staff and immediately demanded to see Julian before the doctors could even finish their morning rounds. There was no trace of the submissive fiancé left in her gaze as she sat up in bed and began issuing a series of rapid-fire legal orders that would dismantle Braxton's stolen life within hours. She looked at the legal documents Julian had prepared and signed her name with a firm hand before instructing him to freeze every single offshore account and revoke all access to the coastal mansion. I want those locks changed before the sun sets today, and I want every penny he stole from my architectural firm tracked back to his personal credit line. Sienna commanded, while her voice remained as cold as the marble floor she had collapsed on. Julian nodded with a professional smirk as he activated the contingency plans they had spent months perfecting behind the scenes, while Braxton was busy playing house with Tiffany. My sister was no longer hiding behind the mask of a struggling freelancer, because the time had come for the entire city to realize she was the chief architect and true owner of the Heritage Project. The first wave of her retaliation hit Braxton like a freight train while he was standing in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting at Tiffany's father's firm. He was busy taking credit for the structural innovations Sienna had designed when Julian and a team of security guards interrupted his presentation to deliver an immediate termination notice. I believe there has been a massive misunderstanding because these designs are my personal intellectual property, and I am the visionary behind this entire project. Braxton stammered while looking around the room for support from a horrified Tiffany. Julian stepped forward and tossed a thick folder of forensic digital evidence onto the conference table with a look of pure contempt for the man standing there. The only visionary in this room is the woman you left for dead in a hospital bed, and she has officially filed a lawsuit for intellectual property theft and corporate espionage against you. Julian stated while the board members began to distance themselves from Braxton as if he were radioactive. Tiffany tried to intervene, but Julian quickly silenced her by mentioning that the police were already outside to discuss her involvement in receiving stolen trade secrets. Braxton was escorted out of the building with nothing but his pride in tatters, while his company-issued smartphone and credit cards were remotely deactivated before he even reached the lobby. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Dorothy was busy planning a celebratory gala when a team of police officers arrived to inform her that she was trespassing on private property owned exclusively by my sister. She began screaming at the top of her lungs and attempted to smash an expensive crystal vase against the wall in a fit of narcissistic rage before the officers intervened. You cannot possibly throw me out of my son's house because he is a successful man who deserves to live in luxury without being harassed by lowly public servants like you. Dorothy shrieked while she was being led down the front steps in handcuffs for disorderly conduct. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the woman who had spent weeks acting like the queen of the neighborhood was loaded into the back of a patrol car. Sienna checked herself out of the hospital later that afternoon and appeared at the corporate headquarters looking absolutely radiant in a custom-tailored suit that screamed power and authority. She met Braxton in the lobby where he was desperately trying to convince the receptionist to let him back into his office to gather his personal belongings. "The only reason you are still standing in this building, Braxton, is because I haven't officially authorized the district attorney to file the grand larceny charges yet," Sienna said, as she stood before him with the regal presence of a true industry leader. Braxton fell to his knees and began begging for mercy while claiming that his mother had pressured him into making those financial decisions, but Sienna just looked down at him with utter disgust. "I spent 3 years building a pedestal for a man who turned out to be nothing more than a common thief, so now you can spend the next decade explaining your genius to a judge," she added before turning her back on him forever. The entire office watched as the man they once admired was reduced to a weeping mess on the floor, while the real power behind the Heritage Project took her rightful place at the head of the table. 2 weeks after being stripped of his borrowed glory and cast out of the elite circles of Charleston, Braxton began to taste the bitter reality of a total social and financial collapse. The glamorous life he had tried to build with Tiffany evaporated instantly when she publicly canceled their engagement and released a scathing statement calling him a talentless fraud who had nearly ruined her family's reputation. Braxton found himself standing on a street corner with nothing but a tattered suitcase and a phone that was blowing up with demands from debt collectors who no longer feared his hollow threats. In a state of absolute desperation, he dialed Sienna's private number dozens of times until she finally picked up just to hear the pathetic sound of his trembling voice. "Sienna, please listen to me for just 1 second, because everything I did was out of fear that I wasn't good enough for you." Braxton sobbed into the receiver while leaning against a cold brick wall. He promised that he would do anything to make it up to her, and even offered to sign a lifetime contract of servitude if she would only drop the criminal charges. Sienna listened to his frantic rambling with a cold silence before she finally spoke with a voice that sounded like a verdict from a high court. "The man I once loved died the moment you stole my soul's work, but you should know that the struggling artist you despised was actually earning over $200,000 a year in secret," she revealed while Braxton gasped for air on the other end of the line. "You didn't just throw away a partner, Braxton, you threw away a fortune and a future that you were never smart enough to build on your own," she added before hanging up on his pathetic pleas. Braxton sat on the curb for hours in a state of agonizing regret while realizing that he had literally thrown away a diamond to chase after a handful of worthless glass. While he was drowning in his own failure, Dorothy was busy making a series of frantic calls to our parents to beg for a financial lifeline that would never come. She reached out to Mom and Dad with a voice full of fake humility, hoping they would overlook the way she had treated their daughter during her stay at the mansion. Mom didn't even let her finish the first sentence before informing her that the only thing she felt for the woman was a deep sense of pity and disgust. "You and your son are lucky that my daughter is a better person than I am, because I would have left you both with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs," Mom said before Dad took the phone to deliver the final blow. Dad told Dorothy that he had already authorized Julian to seek maximum damages for the property she destroyed, and that she should expect a process server at her door by morning. Every bridge they had ever built was now a pile of smoldering ash, leaving them with no allies and a mountain of unpaid bills that were rapidly coming due. The luxury penthouse that Braxton had rented using Sienna's credit line was repossessed by the bank, forcing him to watch as his designer furniture was hauled away by a crew of indifferent movers. He spent that rainy night wandering the historic streets of the city he once thought he owned, realizing that every person he met now looked at him with mockery rather than respect. Braxton realized that his entire identity had been a fragile construction of lies that could not withstand the pressure of a single week in the real world. He looked at the old suitcase in his hand and saw it as a metaphor for his life, empty of anything meaningful and destined to be discarded by the side of the road. Sienna spent that same evening in her studio with Julian, finalizing the plans for a new architectural project that would permanently redefine the Charleston harbor without Braxton's shadow. The contrast between her radiant success and his pathetic downfall was a testament to the fact that you can never truly build a future on a foundation of theft. As the city lights flickered across the water, the realization finally set in for Braxton that the woman he tried to destroy was the only reason he ever mattered. 3 months after the final legal gavels echoed through the historic courtrooms of Charleston, the dust has finally settled on a legacy of betrayal, and the dawn of absolute justice has arrived. Braxton stood before a stern judge who showed no mercy for his calculated schemes, sentencing him to hundreds of hours of grueling community service and ordering the full restitution of every dollar he had embezzled from our family. He now spends his long and humid afternoons picking up trash along the very highways where he once sped in luxury cars that were bought with my sister's hard-earned money. I saw him just last week from a distance, looking broken and aged beyond his years, while wearing a bright orange vest and carrying a heavy plastic bag for refuse. Braxton tried to catch my eye with a look of desperate pleading, but I simply looked through him as if he were a ghost, haunting a city that had already forgotten his name. His mother, Dorothy, faced an equally grim fate after being forced to move into a low-cost, state-funded nursing facility on the outskirts of the county. She spends her lonely days sitting by a cracked window complaining to the indifferent staff about the quality of the tea, while her former high-society friends pretend they never even knew her. I was meant for silk sheets and fine dining, not this wretched place filled with commoners who don't understand my worth, Dorothy shrieked during one of our final legal mediation sessions. Julian just looked at her with a cold smile and reminded her that her worth was now measured solely by the debt she owed to the woman she had tried to destroy. Sienna decided that the coastal mansion held too many memories of a life that was built on a foundation of deception and decided to put the property on the market for a record-breaking price. We spent the last few weeks packing up the few things that actually mattered and preparing for a journey that would take us across the globe to celebrate her newfound freedom. My sister has already been nominated for 3 prestigious international architecture awards for her work on the Heritage Project, which is now being hailed as a masterpiece of modern urban design. As we walked through the empty hallways of the mansion for the last time, Sienna stopped to look at the spot on the marble floor where she had once collapsed in exhaustion. I used to think that this house was the ultimate prize, but I finally realized that my real value was never something that could be contained within these 4 walls, she said with a radiant smile that I hadn't seen in many years. We have completely severed every possible line of communication with Braxton and his mother, ensuring that their toxic energy can never penetrate our world again. Our parents have been our strongest pillars during this transition, helping us organize a massive charity auction for the remaining designer furniture to benefit young artists who lack the resources to start their own firms. The transformation from a victim who was being slowly drained of her life force to a powerful CEO who commands respect in every room she enters has been a profound inspiration to everyone in our circle. Sienna and I are currently sitting in a beautiful cafe in Florence, Italy, looking over the blueprints for a sustainable housing complex that she plans to build for underprivileged families back in South Carolina. She hasn't looked back at the wreckage of her past relationship even once because she is too busy focusing on the limitless horizon of a future that she finally owns. The true sense of liberation didn't come from the bank accounts being restored or the legal victories in court. It came from her realizing that she was always the architect of her own destiny. We often talk about how Braxton and Dorothy are probably still blaming the world for their downfall, while they rot in the misery they created for themselves. The greatest revenge isn't seeing them suffer in poverty, It's living a life so spectacular that their names don't even register in my mind anymore," Sienna remarked, while she sketched a new design in her leather-bound notebook. As the sun sets over the Tuscan hills, I finally understand that some people are meant to be bridges we cross to reach a better version of ourselves. My sister is no longer the woman who allowed parasites to live in her home. She is a force of nature who has learned that self-worth is the only currency that never devalues.